Well, I'm deeply honored and encouraged to be here today. I know this topic of pastoral formation is a deeply controversial one. It's why I'm not only honored and thankful, but I'm also a little bit nervous. I recognize I'm in a little bit of a minority in this room. When it comes to how polarizing this topic has become, I think we should start with the question of why. And as one of our previous speakers mentioned, I believe because it's that we haven't engaged in a lot of difficult conversations like the ones that are taking place at this conference. So I want to begin by just reiterating how grateful I am that you have been willing to host me and allow me to speak here today. I'm part of the group called the Unite Leadership Collective. Tim Allman is the one who leads it. Tim has used every single pastoral formation pathway in the LCMS. I want to start off our time together today with kind of a quick poll by a show of hands between these two options, between how many people are satisfied and think our current pastoral formation system is more than adequate and has everything it needs, and how many would say, no, we need to make some changes. There are room for improvement when it comes to our pastoral formation system. So let's see, for the first one, who thinks it's more than adequate, it has everything it needs? All right, who says, hey, there's room for improvement, there's ways where we could grow? And who's just grumpy and didn't want to vote and raise their hand in here, okay? That's okay, you don't have to vote. At the Unite Leadership Collective, our vision is actually built on the premise that Reverend Grill shared earlier, that the world of today is looking a lot more like the world of the early church than it did 50, 150, 200, 250 years ago, and that should at least be in our minds as we talk about this topic of pastoral formation and what it should look like. That perhaps we should be reading and learning more from the early church, the book of Acts. Perhaps we should be walking alongside our confessional brothers and sisters in the global south to ask how we can best serve the church here in America moving forward. In preparing for this conference, I've been meditating on Matthew 9, verses 35 through 38. Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." Would you please pray with me? Gracious Father, you are the Lord of the harvest. You are the giver of every good gift. Lord, we pray for you to raise up workers for the harvest. We pray, Lord, that you would guide our discussion today, our time today. Give us wisdom, give us diligence, but keep us always grounded on your word of truth, Jesus. In your name we pray. Amen. I think all of us should be willing to say we agree with the words of Jesus there, that we should have compassion on sheep without a shepherd. Currently in the LCMS, we have 562 out of our 5,900 churches. That is 9.5% that do not have a called shepherd. If you're comfortable with me rounding up, that's about 1 out of every 10 LCMS churches that do not have a called pastor. I'm not here to attack our system. I'm not here to try and radically change things. I'm here to just ask if, for the sake of the church, we are willing to think about things not differently, but more sanely, or even just more historically. At the Unite Leadership Collective, our passion for this topic comes from two different places. One is a story of need, and the other is a story of opportunity. My first call was to a church in Santa Clarita, California. And my district out there my circuit out there was a very challenging circuit. We initially had 9 churches together, although over time one of those closed and it went down to 8. And of those 8 churches, only 4 of them had a called pastor full-time serving them. One had a bivocational gentleman. The other 3 did not have anyone called serving them that way. And even for the called full-time pastors that were serving there, only one of those churches could actually afford them off of tithes and offering. For the other 3, they had some supplemental income from a preschool to a sizable donation that they were using interest off of, or something that would help them to just be able to afford a full-time worker that way. This came to a head for me when I had a young man that came to me and said, I think God might be calling me into the office of ministry. And so I sat down and I got to know this young man better, and as we were spending time together, I was particularly convicted by the fact that I'm about to send this man back to college for 3 years, to go to seminary for 4 years, when there's churches right in front of me that need a pastor. So I started to dream, why do we train the pastors the way we do? How have we trained pastors historically? Could we better train pastors bivocationally? Could we do something, because the need is so great? Tim Allman has almost the opposite story of mine. It's not a story of need, but it's a story of opportunity. Tim is in the Phoenix area, in one of the fastest growing counties in America, Maricopa County. They get about 1,000 people there every week. And so Tim and his church had this big vision to say, well, what if we try to start 20 churches in 20 years? I don't know if you know this, but when people move, that's actually one of the most important spiritual formation times in their life, because this is from The Great Dechurching, if you want a book on stats on this, by the way, because in that time period, the habit that happens sometimes is they move and then they just never quite get around to connecting to a church where they move. So Tim at this time was doing doctorate study research, and he was researching different ways of pastoral formation, and he came across a style of formation called competency-based education. If you read some of the work for the conference, you'll see some of the historic Lutheran understanding of this, and in that he also learned about the Kairos Seminary platform. If you don't know what Kairos is, initially it was a project started out of the Sioux Falls Seminary where they said, looking around at the landscape of pastoral formation in America, one of the things that America seemed to be strong at was the content in which pastors learn and grow. Having this educational style where you know the answers, where you have to make sure that you get your test results and your grades high. But one of the frustrations of that system is a frustration not of content, but of character. And even of craft, as our previous speaker mentioned, right? Can they actually socially interact with people? Can they preach a good sermon? And do they have the character to be a pastor? And so in the 90s, Kairos started saying, what would it look like for us to create a mentor systems around pastors as they're learning, that they would have mentors for their personal life, for their social life, that they would have mentors for their education that would be routinely checking in on them as they learn and grow, so that we can have more well-rounded pastors that way. As Tim learned about this process, he sought out to say, what would it look like for me to start to have men that go through this formation style? Initially, he reached out to some seminary professors to see if they would join him, if maybe he could create like an LCMS pathway on Kairos, that platform, creating that mentor-based style that way, but he couldn't get support. They turned him down, and so he looked for the most confessional group he could find. He found the Luther House of Studies out of Canada and decided to partner with them, because as he was starting these churches, he wanted men that would be in leadership positions of these churches to know their confessions, to know their scriptures, to know them well, to make sure that these are men that don't only just know those things, but they have the character and the competencies to lead that way. Now, I know that there are many here that have deep reservations about Luther House of Studies, about the Unite Leadership Collective. I know there's a lot of pushback I've received in conversation. I've had many people that have said, well, why in the world are you making something new? Why shouldn't you just create something and work with the seminary system? And I think personally, we as a church body should be better at applauding innovation. Right? I think we should celebrate the Luther Classical College in Wyoming. They didn't say, hey, we're just going to change the Concordia system. They said, no, we're going to provide something new. We're going to provide an alternative, and then we want to work with our church body that way. I know there's deep reservations about digital learning in our SMP process right now. There's a few reservations I'd love to speak to. The first is this, that digital learning isn't challenging enough. That all digital learning is you sit down in the classroom, you watch a lecture, you make a few posts that week. All right, good to go. But the reality is, when it comes to digital learning or all educational challenges, the bar is as high or as low as you set it to be. We could create something more rigorous than the Masters of Divinity. We could create something longer than the Masters of Divinity. There are full online PhDs in 2025. And so if that's your hang-up, you could create something that's much more rigorous, that is much more difficult and challenging even than our current SMP process, which could become even more robust that way. Also, if that's your reservation, I would also question why we're comfortable partnering with church bodies like our friends up in Canada for them to be able to bring their men to preach in our pulpits if we feel like they have not been well enough ready and prepared digitally that way. There's some that say, well, digital learning is not enough of a sacrifice. I love that in our preparation for this, as we were reading some of Johann Gerhard's work, we talked about Luther's, what forms a theologian that way, right? Oratio, meditatio, tentatio. And sometimes I wrestle with these kinds of comparisons. In my service in the LA area, I got to know a Korean pastor who was going through the SMP process. He had a group of about 11, 12 Korean speakers that because he was going through that process, able to preach the gospel to. But because it's a $40,000 commitment and his church already could not afford to pay him a salary, that is a small group of people, he not only took on another job, but started driving Uber to be able to afford the SMP route. For me to pretend that at 21 years old, in the most flexible season of my life, when I wasn't married, I didn't have kids that way, where I could just pack up everything I owned in the back of a beat-up Toyota Avalon and move to St. Louis, for me to pretend that that's more of a sacrifice than the tentatio he was experiencing, I think we're comparing apples and oranges here. The other pushback that I've heard is that, well, Jesus taught face-to-face, shouldn't we? And I'm really sympathetic to that reality, although I think it's worth pointing out there's like a weird sense of irony in this conference that Reverend Grills couldn't make it, so what do? We brought him in digitally, right? We put him on a screen, and I don't know about you, but I learned a lot from Reverend Grills' presentation that way, but I think there's something really important to that reality of Jesus teaching face-to-face. My time in California, I got to know a pastor who actually, you can talk to me afterward if you want to know more about him, who went to one of our seminaries for a year, and at his time during the seminaries, there was a little bit of discouragement within him because sometimes he would go to the chapels and he wouldn't see the turnout that he was hoping for. Other times he saw some of the partying and things that were going on campus, and he was a little bit scandalized by it. And so that combined with the studies, he took some time off, and he actually went and interned under the pastor he grew up under for a year. During that time, he fell in love with one of the girls that worked at the school there, who felt called deeply by God to be a teacher in that school. And so he said, even though I hold to these convictions of the LCMS, I still feel called to be a pastor. And so he actually went through a route that was not sanctioned by the LCMS. He went through the Institute of Lutheran Theology. He ended up joining the LCMC, even though he does not hold to their confession on women's ordination. And it was interesting in talking with him where he said, it's fascinating because people will say, well, you have to have that face-to-face experience. But when I was learning digitally that way, my pastor and I would translate 2 psalms together every morning. And we talk about what it means for our lives. It was like a Dietrich Bonhoeffer life together reality of dwelling in the Word. Yes, you can learn face to face by mentors around you in a way that reflects Jesus. When it comes to the tension of this conversation, I like to think of it in 2 sorts of graphs. They're on your handout, but I don't know how well they came out in black and white. The first graph you'll see is the ages of all active LCMS parish pastors. The active age, this is from roster and statistics from a couple months ago, is 53 years old. And the first tension is simply this. If you were to take the pastors on this list, right, and you were to fast forward about 10 years in time, you'll have nearly half, 48.8% of our current pastors that are going to be retirement age, 65 up, or retiring. Now, you might say, well, that's not including the next batch that's coming up, right? Even if we assume some really aggressive growth, that our seminaries are having bigger class sizes. So if we assume, 10%, well, you still have about, that 38%, like 1/3 that are moving into that age. Quick show of hands in the room here today. How many of you are 55 and up? I know some of you don't want to raise your hands from earlier. It's okay. But that should be telling for us in terms of the need for pastors, that just in the past few years, we've gone from 9.1 to 9.4. As things continue with our current process, that's going to continue to grow. However, there is a second real conversation to be had, and one that I don't know other speakers have brought up, but I still think it's really important, and that's the size of our congregations as well. Ryan Burge and also Lyman Stone did this too. I just didn't include his in this. You should read the Lutheran Religious Life surveys he puts out. They're amazing. Did research on the age of different Protestant traditions. And for the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, he found for those who attend worship, it was about 67% that were 55 and up. Now, I don't have a perfect projection on these things, but I think it's pretty easy to see, and also anecdotally from pastors, I've had this conversation where in the short term, in the next 15 or 20 or so years, we're going to see a lot of congregations that are going to need pastors. But in the long term, once we get to that 20-year plus mark, we're going to start to see a lot of congregations that are going to struggle to be able to afford a pastor. And in many ways, there's a lot of churches that are already there, churches that, thanks be to God, will work together to form 2, 3, 4-point parishes. Like, the reality is, if you're a pastor in this room, I know you're not in it for the money. Lyman Stone did research with the Lutheran Religious Life Survey and said that LCMS pastors earn 50% less than men of similar educational backgrounds and 15% less than LCMS lay people of similar education. Now, at the Unite Leadership Collective, when it comes to this topic of pastoral formation, we think it's not just that we should, do trendy, happen in leadership terms or hipster terms or whatever. No, we should also look back and learn from ourselves historically. Like, this is not the first time that our church body has seen a shortage of pastors. Has anybody ever heard of the office of the Besucher before? No? Okay, cool. You guys are in for an awesome lesson. By the way, there's a QR code if you want to read some old church documents about these different offices that way. So the Besucher was formed at the beginning of our synod as things were starting to expand, where we said, okay, well, we need people to go start communities of faith. We need essentially church planners. So we're going to form this office that would be a pastor that would go out to places where people are speaking German, gather them together, and then start a church. But we ran into a big problem with the Besucher. First off, we already didn't really have enough pastors just to meet the needs as it is, and I'd say we still have this today when you still have 50 or 60 churches that are asking for the seminary for a pastor and aren't receiving one. And then the second was an important theological one when you think of the theology of the call. What does it mean that this man actually doesn't have a parish he's called to that way? And so in response of this, we actually later formed the office of the colporteur. This was a layman who was tasked with distributing religious materials, books, goods across the frontiers, was in charge of gathering German people together with those books that would start devotional groups, would start studies together, and would actually even have times where he'd run through a service. He'd read through a pastor's sermon that way. The first was Gustav Fau. He was commissioned in 1852, but this speaks to the nature of who we are as a church body, where we've said, okay, we see this opportunity, we could do something here. Like, we used to be so much about finding these kinds of opportunities. We would send pastors to the docks so that when immigrant boats would unload, they would listen in for the German speakers, they would ask them where they were going, and they would point them to a pastor in a church that they could connect to that way. This is part of what's so beautiful about our church body. At the Unite Leadership Collective, our main passion when it comes to pastoral formation is to look at our Lutheran confessional identity, to look at our church's history, to look at our missional heart, and to just ask the question, what if? What if we brought back the colporteur? What if we were more intentional about starting challenging, robust high schools, which, like, shout out to Wittenberg Academy, that said we're going to actually train our high schoolers up so much more that they would be ready to move into those pastoral ministry offices faster? What if we strategically invested in African and other immigrant leaders in a way where we'd send them to airports so that when new immigrants arrive, we could help connect them to a church where they could worship? What if we started a bivocational training track so that we could have more worker priests in our body, especially in a California context where we can't get guys because of the cost of living there? What if we took seriously AC 14 and the fact that every church should have a rightly called servant of the word, preaching and delivering the sacraments? What if we started a new church planting track to strategically plant churches in growing urban and suburban areas because the shortage already is so great we've gotten rid of that track? There's a lot of powerful things that can happen when you just start with that question of what if. I want to go back to this age stat for a second, where you look and see, right, 67%, 2/3 of our body, that's 55 and older currently. Because that can be something that's intimidating, that can be something that feels dreadful, and yet we have 2/3 of our body that may well be stepping into a season where they could serve the church and the wider body of Christ in ways that we haven't thought of before. Like, the reality is that the Unite Leadership Collective, we don't want to be rogue. We just want to create something together so that every church can have a rightly called and ordained servant to give them the word, to preach, to give them the sacraments, and to raise men up so that we could start even more churches. We want an educational pathway that is deeply robust, that's not easy, that's challenging, that's affordable, but is also accessible, especially to men who would consider being worker priests. If you're here today and you're on the fence about these things, if you're here today, and even if you're not on the fence on these things, in closing, I just want to ask this simple question. And just so you know, I did intentionally write this to be very short because I want there to be good, healthy dialogue about this. And the question is simply this: what would it take to change your mind? What would it take to change your mind about pastoral formation to say, wow, we're going to learn from the early church? What would it take to change your mind about pastoral formation in terms of saying, yeah, there is a need? If it's not 1 in 10 churches, is it 2 in 10, 3 in 10? If half of our churches didn't have a pastor, would you ever consider changing your mind? I want to thank you again all so much for just allowing me to get up and speak today. I can't wait to just hear your perspectives, your stories. If you don't get time during the Q&A, seriously, find me at the Gemütlichkeit. Not a German speaker, that's my wife. Because when we work together, when we have those hard conversations, it's incredible what God can do. Thank you.
Thank you for being here, Pastor. A couple of comments about your comments. Number one, if the public school system in the United States of America would follow the Missouri synod system of keeping schools open, they'd have a huge shortage of teachers as well. And in regards to your comment about mentors, wouldn't it make sense to go to a residential seminary where you would have 10 or 20 or more mentors rather than just one man who obviously is not Jesus? And the third thing is, why not go to the seminaries, the 2 that we have, and ask them to be more of a gold standard and encourage them to increase. I've heard my friend Pastor Bruss talk. We do not have a gold standard at either of our seminaries. We have a standard, but we don't have a gold standard, and encourage them then to create that gold standard.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to make sure, because you asked 3 questions. I know the second was the mentor-related question. The third was the gold standard. What was the first again?
The public school system.
Public schools. Dude, preach on that. So I'm in the Southwest. our schools are overflowing because of everything. I was in the Southwest where our schools are overflowing because of that reality. And also, I had an opportunity where my wife, in the town we were in, it wasn't Lutheran, it was a private Christian classical academy in that town that she served at. And that academy was known for having such a robust educational level that people were clamoring to get into it. So yeah.
Not that I'm pro public education.
No, I get you. I totally agree that way. When it comes to the mentor number, I think it's an interesting thing to bring up because I don't know if I articulated this well in the conversation. With Luther House of Studies or with Kairos, the idea is you actually have different people mentoring you individually in all those separate areas of your life. It's not just one man that way because you don't want a pastor to be formed in one person's image. I actually know, at least for CSL, my seminary, they've actually sought to be a little more intentional in their mentorship since I've been there. I'm not gonna lie, when I first went to seminary, I was like deeply afraid that they were gonna find like some wrong thought with me and just kick me out and say, you're never good enough to be a pastor because you held to blah, 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 for the first 2 years I was there. And it wasn't until the 4th year I was there that I realized, no, they want to whip the heresies out of you while you're here. Go and be an idiot and have those conversations with your teachers that way. But I would say, if you look at the student to faculty ratio of the seminaries, it'd be interesting to do a comparison to see how much of that one-on-one relational mentor time students have with teachers that way as opposed to other formation routes. Oh, and then for the gold standard in working with the seminaries to create something new, I love that. I wish that we would have been better at that with the Unite Leadership Collective from the very get-go. I think that's a growth area. But even with the SMP program, for example, right? That didn't come from the seminary saying, hey, we want to create a new formal track to ministry. The seminaries are crazy busy, man. They have all sorts of things that they're doing at that point in time. We should work with them that way, and that's a regret that we didn't. But if you look historically within our church body, it's very rare that our seminaries have ever created new pathways to ministry. Like even, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong on this historically, please. Even with Fort Wayne, it's not like our synod got together and say, hey, we need another seminary. That way is Leahy who saw the need and ultimately started it. And then our synod said, oh, hey, yeah, we'll partner.
Our previous talk, we heard about one of the problems that pastors face is too much time on their devices. And now we're looking at a program that actually encourages more time on a device. Yeah. And how is that mentor over the screen going to say, you need to spend less time in front of a screen?
No, thank you for pointing this out because I didn't articulate this well. The expectation is you have, other than your academic mentor, for those other mentors, they are face-to-face, in person, in your life. They are surrounding pastors, or even in the case of a family life mentor, that's somebody that can just be a wise leader from a congregation that way.
And I appreciate the fact that you stress that you're not trying to be rogue.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there are systems out there that are. And that's the problem, is when you've got them trying to be rogue, then that reflects on everyone else that may be not trying to be rogue. So you're always held to that suspicion.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for being here. Kind of a question in relation to some of the Leadership Collective I've worked with, Luther House of Study, and their partner Kairos. At least in approach, those are broadly pan-Lutheran approaches. Now I know it's a platform and maybe it's an a la carte approach, but with respect to maintaining, theological consistency, how do you suggest that we go about doing that if you were drawing from a faculty that has different approaches, some of whom are LCMS, some of whom are ELCA? Today, whether it's SMP or residential seminary, you're drawing from LCMS faculty. As an adult convert to the LCMS from the ELCA, I can tell you what your pastor believes about the sacraments, what they believe about specific sins. All those things do matter. So how do we ensure that?
Yeah, that's good. The best way to ensure it would be to create an LCMS pathway with LCMS instructors and LCMS people through Kairos that way, which would be, a dream scenario. The other kind of reality no, actually that's the ideal way that I'll speak to, is that it would be creating LCMS people for it. The other thing I would say is for the like 9.5% of churches that don't have a called pastor, one of the things I struggle with is you think of what effectively happens in these churches. Most of the time it's, okay, we're going to bring out retired pastors in the area, if we have retired pastors in the area. And then you get to a point even where I've known churches that say, well, we can't get a retired pastor. We're not even going to gather together for a time of worship today, which is deeply alarming. Or there's people that say, well, we don't have a retired pastor, so I'm going to use this pre-written sermon. And there's people that say, well, we don't have a retired pastor, so I'm going to say something. I want that person to have theological education and not lead people astray. And I do want it to be LCMS people.
For being here and sharing your opposing viewpoint, I guess. I don't know what else to call it. But my question, I guess, is going back to the statistics side of things. You mentioned that, most of our pastors are over the age of 50. And I think my question is, if you were to do a cross-section of like just LCMS members in general, would it not be much of the same thing? And wouldn't that minimize kind of the impact of this pastor shortage? I'm not saying that there won't be a pastor shortage, but could it possibly be like an overstated problem, I guess?
Yeah, no, the way I think of it, and this is, I'd love for, I think Lyman Stone spells it out way more articulate than I would in his Those Who Are Called to Teach, is one of his more recent Lutheran religious life surveys. It seems that there's going to be a pretty pressing need for pastors in the short term, but because of the aging demographics of the body and how you think of contributions within a congregation work, in the longer term you will have more of a shortage of ways to be able to pay a pastor that way. Yeah.
So part of the challenge that I see from a district president perspective is that the situations are very different across the U.S. As one of the brothers just mentioned, there probably do need to be some congregations that close, at least in our area. The situation on the coast, of course, is the distance, but the distance between congregations in Nebraska some can be large, but many of them are minimal as far as kind of pairing up. In California, Nevada, different areas, that distance is a whole lot different. So that's just one observation, is that I think for many of us in the Midwest, we don't have a picture of those challenges, where you can't do a triple parish and actually serve them in any kind of meaningful way. And certainly there can be no, kind of local pastor presence that I think is important. One of the other observations that I would have is to have 1 in 10 vacant congregations is not always a bad thing. Because when I started 10 years ago, we had far fewer vacancies, and it really inhibited the opportunity to help guys move around, where it was time, where it would be good for a guy to have a new challenge, a congregation have a new pastor. And so trying to move guys was much more of a challenge 10 years. I mean, that seems like a lifetime ago now. So I think I don't know how you would speak to that.
Yeah,
right? That would be one question, I guess.
No, you're good. I appreciate both of those. There's a reason why in California we don't measure distance by distance, we measure it by time. We say this is how long it takes there, because someone could get in a car crash and you're going to get another hour on top of it, so you have to have that flex room. When I was a pastor in California, we never started any of our funerals on time ever, because inevitably people would be traveling from far away, there would be a car crash, we'd have to wait 20, 30 minutes. It's not that they crashed, but on the major road that they were taking. So I appreciate your recognition that way. For the 1 in 10 number, I think that's a really fair point, one I'm kind of sympathetic to. So back when I was in college, I studied business administration, not because I like business, but because I had a pastor who said people hand you finance sheets and you actually need to be able to read them. And in economics, it's interesting, they have the idea of unemployment, which is you actually never want an unemployment rate of 0, because it locks everybody into where they're working. You need fluidity in the market. And so for most economists, they'll put peak unemployment rates at somewhere from 2 to 4%. This is, and you can read, I use this comparison a little bit in the book. But when you look at economic unemployment rates where you start to get to 9 or 10%, okay, you're hitting recession point there, where it might be easier for the person who's trying to place somebody into a new job, but for the wider market, there's some problems going on.
So the last question I would have is, cost notwithstanding in terms of SMP program.
Yeah.
Are there any statistics, at least in my experience, and again, limited experience, but I don't know that we have a lot of guys who would move to an online program, even if it were, I mean, since we have SMP,
yeah,
with its mentoring, local setting, all those kinds of things. Are there any statistics? How many potential candidates are we actually losing? I mean, and that's like hard to say,
Yeah, that's so
who
anecdotal.
didn't die today?
Yeah.
But
well, and especially like the reason why, and I tried to tell this in the story at the beginning a little bit, why like for Tim's passion around it is like he would say, there's a bunch because we should be trying to start new churches and new ministries. He's on fire. He's like, we need like 400 pastors because we need to start the bazillion churches in the Phoenix area. You listen to him go sometime. He is huge on that idea. I honestly don't know that there's been research done on how many people would say, yeah, I'd consider being a worker priest or a bivocational priest, but the cost and everything else is, yeah, that'd be good to do.
Recognizing up front there are exceptions, specific contexts. We have the SMP that was meant to address that. Whether that's been followed according to the rules in every place is a question. But and hypothetically, what's that? Yeah. Will be like supporting immigration, which is a great thing, versus illegal immigration. If it's abused, that's a problem. But and that hurts immigration, which we want. But anyways, so and hypothetically, let's just say, because based on your talk, you mentioned costs, financial burdens. Just hypothetically,
yeah,
say all those things are covered.
Yeah,
like everything from the tuition, which already basically is from what I understand.
Not SMP is $40,000 if you're going that route. But if you physically move to the seminary, then it's covered.
So all financials, and not only domestic to an extent, education, food, housing, everything covered.
Yeah.
Okay, those things are hypothetically not an issue. Then I guess from what you presented,
yeah,
which was very interesting on a digital learning model. I guess my question to you then is, if hypothetically all those things are covered,
yeah,
do you personally think
should we do Kairos if it's covered?
Well, do you think that is a digital learning model is a better model,
yeah,
than a residential seminary model for pastoral education and formation? If so, I just am curious to know how you think it's better.
I don't think I would ever mentally agree with saying it's better than a residential seminary model, just like I wouldn't feel comfortable saying that I think it's better than the mentorship model of Paul. I think God uses different types of ways that he's forming pastors in different seasons. I think our seminaries are beautiful, amazing. I wouldn't trade my seminary education for anything in the world. I wish that I would have learned at an earlier age that I can say stupid things to teachers and they'll correct me that way. But yeah, I don't know that I would say it's better as much as the question is what does the church need?
I mean, because that would get back to, if you're setting financials,
yeah,
putting aside a specific context for the Korean, different situation, the different standard. So I guess I'm just asking if the burden is more the costs and trying to alleviate those than it is trying to come up with alternatives because of those costs.
So to paint Tim's another kind of situation from Tim again. So one of the reasons I'm close to Tim, I vicared under him for a year when I was in St. Louis, and one of the ministries that we started was in the neighboring suburb of Mesa called La Mesa. It was a time where we would have food and a meal with the working poor and homeless, and then afterward we would have a worship service. There would regularly be about 100 to 120 people at that worship service, but the tithes and offerings for that service is like $20 or $40 a week on a good week. That church would not get a call in our current system. So I think there's those opportunities that it would be well built for.
Thank you so much for being here. Personally, I think these sorts of conferences are always best when you have opposing views. It just makes it more interesting. So thank you for making it interesting for us.
Thanks, man.
I have a lot of questions and thoughts, but I'm just going to stick to one. And I don't know, maybe we'll have a chance to talk later. But I think for some people, you know, a lot of the hesitancy to go kind of an online route was because of our experience with COVID.
Yeah.
It seems to me that, you know, with COVID, you know, a lot of things were shut down. And so suddenly, including our schools, and a lot of kids were suddenly, you know, parents were told you have to do kind of the online education. You're not going to kid to in a classroom, and it hurt them. It hurt the kids. They just, in many different ways, that we look at, a lot of us look at that and go, wow, that was a disaster. That was a disaster. So I think that might be, at least for me and probably others, one of the things that makes us a little hesitant to, you know, maybe consider this. So you've been sharing a lot of anecdote stories and so forth, which are helps us visualize. But I'm curious if there's been any studies done that either you
on digital learning.
Yeah, just on you know,
They're not great.
well, just to kind of showing, you know, maybe you can speak to this. Like, why is it that with the kids, digital learning just didn't work for them, was bad, but here's evidence that it would work in this scenario with these adults becoming pastors.
Yeah.
I'd love to have some more information on that.
I can speak a little bit to that. So yeah, there are studies, and I think a number of them come out from COVID years, where it's like digital learning, when you're just sitting watching a Zoom call with the teacher, it's not good. It's not as good as being there in person that way. But I would also caution us in saying, okay, that means we have to do residential, because at the same time right now, if we're learning that one of the better learning models that's coming out in America right now is individual AI tutorship, I would never be comfortable saying we should have an individual AI tutorship model of pastoral formation. That would be insane. But the other thing I would juxtapose that with as well, in terms of classroom education, there is, you know, definitely data that says that it's learning via Zoom in connection that way, and you guys kind of experienced some of it earlier. You don't internalize as much of the information. On the flip side of that, there's also a lot of data that shows that if you are doing the work that you are learning about while you're learning it, that you are much more likely to internalize it.
Thank you again. You know, as everybody else has said, thank you for your presentation, and thank you for fielding all of these questions. It's really appreciated. I had a question, maybe a little bit more of the history and development of some of these things. You mentioned that early on in kind of the beginning days of Unite Leadership Collective, as you know, finding the Kairos system, that it was taken to, you know, the faculty at St. Louis. They reviewed it, they didn't like it.
It wasn't that formal, not that formal. It was, we reached out to some professors that we knew and had a relationship with and said, hey, could you come on board with that? And they said, no, we can't. Well, it should, yeah, I wish we would have been more formal with it.
Because I guess that's where my question actually is because it seems like, as it was presented to those within our communion, and then turned down or rejected, that then the next step was to go to someone outside the communion. And, you know, to go to Lutheran House of Study, who includes, you know, people who are going to be teaching these classes, who do not believe the same things we do about not just the teachings of the Bible, but about the Bible itself, that it is inspired, that it is inerrant, and the same thing about the Book of Concord, right? That we believe what it says because it agrees with the Scriptures, right? As opposed to insofar as. And so that was the part there that I was hoping for a little bit of clarity on, right? So, because it seemed like, and maybe I just misunderstood, but it seemed like those within the communion said, no, this is a bad idea, so let's go outside the communion and keep trying it rather than maybe rethinking the idea, is kind of how it came across.
So, and this is, Tim had these exchanges, not me, but in my talking with him, it wasn't, no, we think this is a bad idea. It was, we're just too committed to say yes to another thing, right? Like if you talk with seminary professors, they're constantly flying all over, they're writing commentaries, they have a billion things that they're doing at any given point in time. And so it wasn't like oh, we think this is horrible, at least anecdotally. It was just, we're not able to commit to this.
And then the next step was to
find somebody outside the communion that would.
Well, which seems like to have our guys know their confessions and to have those conversations in relationship about how, like, and I don't know that teachers hold to view of Scripture isn't inspired or inerrant that way, but for them to have that theological education as they're going out and leading in different places would probably be still better than none of it, or the Bible Network being on in the background as they like walk around in their house, or other kind of things where people get catechized that way. So it's one of those, there's definitely room for improvement in what we're doing, and I agree there. Thank you.
My comment, because it's not really a question, is somewhat outside the scope of the conference, but it's completely related. I served a dual parish in Montana, 50 miles between the parishes. So your comment about distances in the West. I currently serve in the Northwest District in Washington State.
Yeah.
The conversation always comes back around to, and you've said it several times, is the cost and whether congregations can support their pastors. You talked about the parish that, the tithes and offerings on a good week would be $40.
Yeah.
A brother in my circuit recently did a study on the history of how Lutherans have paid for their pastors.
Yeah.
And the whole tithes and offerings thing is brand new.
Mm.
We never used to rely on the offerings of the people to support the ongoing work of the church. The offerings of the people were alms to give to the poor. And it's varied differently throughout the history on what sorts of streams of income a parish might have. But this whole conversation about, how do we pay for pastors?
Yeah.
And with the brother up front,
Yeah.
if we pay for seminary and if we figure out how to help our small parishes afford to pay a pastor a living wage, we can up the gold standard. We can make it golder.
So when there's an issue that isn't glaringly clear to the whole body, such as this seems to be, I know we tend to have our opinions. So there's sort of an impasse, and there's this new thing called electronic technology, AI, et cetera, and this is just where we are. This isn't new to the church in history. Just in my daily Bible reading, I've been in Kings lately, and there you see Elijah is kind of like a lone wolf. He's out there, and but there are other prophets, Obadiah, with the sons of the prophets, and they're in the cave, and but the times aren't good for Israel. And so, but those prophets are together, and they're dealing with this. What are they doing in that time when they're together? Well, they're having theological discussion, I'm sure. And why are they, close together at that? Well, because there's some depth, and we're working through these issues. How can we minister to the punctiliar issue that we're at an impasse of? That God's word, it's there. We know that the Lord is there, and so how is this best discovered? How what we should address? Elijah seems to know. Elijah has had, the Lord has revealed, especially to him, what needs to be revealed. And this is a new time in history in terms of technology and all the aspects that it affects the human person. Is theological learning, is that different from other sorts of learning? I mean, you can go online and get your, Arizona, Phoenix University or whatever, they're online for any sort of degree. And yeah, we can have the same information. It'll be out there, as we all well know. But is theological learning, is catechesis, is that different from the other sort of head learning or what we can gain, with a Zoom conversation?
Yeah.
Okay. What might be missing?
Yeah.
In terms of so that we can minister to our members, that in-person aspect. I mean, that's going. I know you're doing that. Any pastor is doing that. But the depth that is gained by being in that proximity, where pastors are being ministered to among themselves regularly in great depth. It's part of why we have a physical conference. We have physical conferences. This wouldn't work if we were all at a great Zoom meeting. Those are some things I want to throw out for consideration.
One of the things I love about this conference, and it was spoken about in Pastor Grills's presentation a lot, and even if you did the readings on Johann Gerhardt's pastoral formation, is historically in the church, the big thing that is always there when it comes to pastoral formation, one of the biggest and most important things is the character of the individual. And the character of the individual is something that, if we were going to adopt this sort of a pathway, is something that, you can hide behind online. Right? Like the same way that you can use a web browser to access Wittenberg Academy, you could use Pornhub or all sorts of other evils that way. And so that even more says, how do we make sure that we're putting people around this man, if we were going to adopt this kind of a pathway, to make sure that they have the character of a pastor that way. And it was quick we'll do a quick pop quiz on who did the readings. How long was the average amount of time that men spent at Johann Gerhardt, or at the pastoral formation system from the reading? Anyone remember it? Oh no, 1.8 years. But to Grills's credit, and he really unpacked this, that was with a very, very different educational system than we have today, right? Very different. So anyway, thank you guys again so much for letting me speak here. Thank you for this time together. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to even more conversations.